If you were put through that racket, what happened was horrible. I'd like to think where I came from that would have already been dealt with. It would have just been something the community handled. But we have a presumably process regarding the law and a legal process for a reason, and that means public accountability, and that means that the state and or the authority, including the institutional structural authority, needs to take responsibility for creating deterrence from things like that to happen in the future. First, let me say, if anybody is willing to come out and be public about what they experienced in terms of violence, nobody else has the right to say it needs to be kept confidential in order to protect them. There has been too much abuse in the last several years where certain people were allowed to be mischaracterized or maligned as having some sort of security threat. They were allowed to be blacklisted without even being told which blacklist they were on and for what reason. Certain people were subjected to illegal and illicit fake FISA proceedings as a way to torment them and to harvest their human capital for expropriation by other people that right now are trying to invest it in all kinds of other efforts while we're supposed to be socially engineered into compliance with acceding to the demands of a public health pandemic response that doesn't actually make sense from the perspective of a public health response to a pandemic. So I don't think that there's only one person this happened to. I think that there are other people, and I think that more people lived than are being acknowledged now. And I'm hoping that what's going to happen is that the fear and the intimidation tactics are going to dissipate. And that leverage is going to dissolve. And part of that means that we're going to have to deal with some very real needs in order to attend to that. We need an immediate and honest exposure of what happened to the Interpol database on child sex predators that was reported as hacked in 2016. We need an unsealing of the evidence of the investigation into allegations regarding Jeffrey Epstein and how they may correlate with the above. We need exposure around institutional and financial arrangements connected to allegations of child sex abuse and the Catholic Church, as well as other faith-based institutions involved with nonprofit or tax-exempt status. We need a crackdown on the culture of gentlemen's clubs and any equivalent for women or members of the LGBT community that engage in prostitution or use sexual extortion for acts of espionage. These are the core elements of how they're able to justify keeping organizations like this going and also provide them with the kind of cover they need to get away with what they're doing. Finally, we're almost done here. Yes, space. We need a serious reconsideration of the merits of what is permitted as commercial space travel, as well as greater disclosure of what is going on in regards to military use of space. There were allegations from people who worked at NASA for a significant amount of time around sexual harassment, but other concerns. This was a part of the public reporting that NASA had to do in 2017 and 2018. What has happened with those allegations? Where did the investigations into those allegations go? Unfortunately, nowadays, these allegations of sexual harassment also need to be evaluated around the proliferation of the industrialization of insurance regarding sexual harassment, as opposed to dealing with the origins of where that sexual harassment insurance came from, just like concepts of cyber insurance. These were programs or kinds of insurance that were previously covered under terrorism risk insurance, but now they're being parsed out and separated. Why? I believe it's absolutely connected to misrepresentations of what's considered to be acceptable commercial use of space and space-related technologies. One of the first places we in the U.S. can start is in discussing the current role the U.S. has with Japan regarding research and development related to space technologies, while also addressing concerns regarding the disaster at Fukushima. The space race and the nuclear arms race are directly connected globally and domestically. It is imprudent to pretend otherwise. I have a website, and on the website, I make a very specific case, so to speak, for the concept of the rule of law in the space age. At that time, I spoke specifically about litigation that was ongoing. But at this point, I'm actually discussing it more from an understanding of the legislative history in the United States and its relationship with international treaties regarding commercial and other kinds of space access. I have several ideas and plans in addition to that. But for one thing, on one hand, to start, Space Force should be immediately disbanded, and Space Com should be assessed for its capacity to adequately address the current needs. I think that Space Force was a unwise idea at the wrong time. There were significant changes that were happening to Space Com or Space Command. That was a joint military endeavor, but that was very heavily or primarily influenced by a specific branch of the United States military. And that rather than dealing with misbehavior and inappropriate abuse of space technologies and space-related matters within the military and in connection with others attempting to disabuse the relationships with the military in order to do inappropriate things related to space, somebody decided to up the ante, so to speak, with the creation of Space Force. And I believe that was absolutely the wrong direction. And what we needed to do was we needed to withdraw that aspect or that consideration and instead clean up our own houses, so to speak, which includes reining in misabuse regarding Spacecom and also acknowledging and preserving some of the valuable things that were going on with Spacecom in the years preceding or immediately connected to the 2017 Transition Authority Authorization Act. We need to reestablish the Office of Liaison between the military and the civilian sectors that was in the original 1958 Act, but that at some point thereafter ended up getting retracted. And we need to get to the bottom of what the legislative as well as executive office levels did with the National Space Council as defined specifically in the 2017 legislation, and to distinguish that from the National Security Council. We also need to follow up on the request for within 100 days of passage of the NASA Transition Authority Authorization Act of 2017 that a report concerning duplicates and forgeries related to space matters be provided. I contend that a considerable number of matters we're dealing with now would be constitutionally and appropriately addressed if we actually acknowledged that there was a legislative requirement for such a report and that we were to actually follow the law in that regard. So that's the best I can do to answer the questions right now. I hope whoever right now feels like it's appropriate for them to access my identity and to try to splice it up and reconfigure it and resequence it to serve their purposes, reconsiders. See, I don't want to be put in a position where I'm supposed to do that as a means by which to disengage your capabilities to sabotage me or my constituents. I'm giving you fair warning. It's unacceptable and it's inappropriate. It's also completely unnecessary.